In this episode, James meets an old enemy of his father's and discovers an unforgivable truth. He didn't know where he was going. The street signs, the faces that glided by, the buildings, all were a blur. As he passed them, a memory of his grandpa standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom of their old home returned to him. The man wore his Lincoln green robe and stared at his reflection, mumbling nonsense words. A beautiful old book lay open on the chiffonier. James remembered thinking, "Grandpa wants to be like my dad, Jack. Jack Dreadful." Grandpa was full of stories about Jack. There were stories about him escaping assassins on a flying carpet, battling nefarious sea creatures, or escaping the fiery breath of a dragon. Jack was of such legendary status, his own father would stand before the mirror with an ivory glint in his eyes, longing to cast the same extraordinary magic he had. He remembered that Arthur's eyes had caught his peeking through the crack in the door, and he had smiled.
When I want the people of Erd to think of magic, I want them to think dreadful. Mr. Dreadful,
Arthur had said, gesturing theatrically. And that was what happened. He got onto the show called Top Magician and performed magic like no other magician. In one show, he remembered seeing Mr. Dreadful fold a piece of origami. With a breath, he sent it fluttering around the stage, its paper wings flapping. Then, like a butterfly, it flew off into the audience. He blew a spell from the palm of his hand. The paper burst. Swallowtails of all hues darted over the heads of awestruck spectators. You had been a great sorcerer, just as you'd wanted. But where had you been for me, you old bastard? He passed several buildings, some with cast iron bars over brightly lit windows. Trails of water trickled nosily around his sneakers. A building, outfitted in a sweater of thick ivy, glistened in the waning dusk. A thin mist, tickling his nose, cheeks, and eyebrows, was all that remained of the earlier downpour. The sky glowed violet, streetlights sparkled, revealing unfamiliar road signs. He turned down an alley, then another, his mind working with each beat his soul made on the cobbled street. He kicked an empty soda can just to hear it clatter against the curb. Finally, he stopped and looked around. It was getting chilly out, and he folded his arms. He didn't know where he was going, but he felt he couldn't go back. To hell with him, he thought. But he was in Paris. Where would he go? He turned around and started to head back up the alley, when he heard the small squeak of a rat rambling through a nearby trash bin. A rat, he thought. Well, there's nothing strange about a rat. Yet, his body involuntarily offered up a shiver, remembering his grandfather's fear of them. He started to move on, but then another one appeared, sniffing around the tail of the first. So, 2 rats. Big deal. But then another pink nose. Another pink tail. It's just a family. He no sooner thought that, when a whole mischief of the rodents poured out of the dumpster. They fell, like a rain of plump fur balls, squealing and tumbling into old cartons and falling belly first on beer cans. Suddenly, an unexpected, foul odor filled the air. He was in an alleyway with dingy cardboard boxes, newspapers, McDonald's tinfoil wraps, a forgotten sneaker, and Chinese food containers. But this smell was not garbagey. It was like the rot coming off a wasteland where bloated corpses lay with escaping gases, flies performing litanies in the still air. He paused and looked down the narrow alley, a shiver sneaking along his spine again. He saw one of the streetlights flicker out, then come back on. Something seemed off. He swallowed hard, feeling a knob of fear probe his stomach. Then he heard the sound of the door closing. It was no ordinary door. It was like one to a deep cellar, or an old, abandoned house. Footsteps. It was quiet in the alley. So quiet, he could hear the sound of the wind rustling the edge of a newspaper and pushing a styrofoam cup around. But the footfalls were loud, with each one resounding off the brick walls. Thump. 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 Clunk. Thump. 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 Clunk. He couldn't help it. paralysis took control of his muscles, making his calves weak. As the sound drew nearer, the streetlight blinked against the wall in front of him, producing a strobing effect on the sudden shadow that appeared. He stifled a surprised gasp. It was the hunched shape of an old man, or creature, small and bald, and with hair growing out of its ugly, bulbous ears. It gripped a stick with a rat skull in its tight, clawed fingers.
I knew I know magic, the kind made by wizards of the old world.
What do you want?
James shouted, his heart racing.
I think you know.
He said with that sickly giggle.
I knew your father.
Go away, freak!
9 years ago, a curious boy opened a magical book. A flash blinded that boy. And then, formidable laughter filled his ears. What did the boy see behind his eyes, I wonder? Do you remember, boy?
James did. That was the night of the fire. It was the same beautiful book he'd seen sitting on his grandfather's chiffonier. He'd opened it, curiously, and saw a cowled man in his mind. The cowled man was laughing. He had the same citron eyes as Arthur, but they were as hot as a phoenix's vengeance. His hair was midnight black, and it touched his shoulders with oily, tangled locks, and he had a face as cruel as poisoned ice. But most importantly, he wore the robe, long and hooded, hiding his face. It was the same man from his nightmares. Dad? And suddenly, he had thrown the book on the floor, screaming.
So, you do remember. You learned that day who your father was. And when you saw him, you buried the book.
It was evil. It should not have been his.
Yes. Evil James. Because your father was Jack. Dreadful. The Dark Lord.
Stop! That's not true.
He screamed, covering his ears. He still remembered how the rats had come that night. They had come for Arthur's book. They came through the doors, making tiny noises, twitching their tiny pink nostrils, flicking their tiny tails. Arthur had come up into the attic after hearing James scream, and when he saw the rats, he acted on instinct. He raised his hand and...
Ignore!
He did not have a magic scroll that time. Fire sprang magically from his fingertips. But all James could see of his grandpa was an image of his father. I stopped believing after that. I stopped believing in the magic world. I stopped believing in my grandfather. But mostly, I'd stopped believing in him, my father. That was when he became the banker. I made him the banker. His foster parents had not told the Bradys. He had told them. He'd said it as far back as that night of the fire. He wanted it to be true so bad, he forgot that he had invented it. And he did it because he had learned the truth about Dad.
I've been waiting all these years for your father's dark secrets. Now, tell me, boy, where did you bury it?
Suddenly, James felt a warm hand grab his shoulder, and a voice said,
Why not go find it yourself, you pot-bellied freak? I hear hell has a copy.
He looked up and saw his grandfather standing beside him in the alley.
Grandpa?
James whispered.
James.
He said, looking at him.
Run!
He heeded his grandfather and turned and ran. The shadow crept up the side of the building like a spider, laughing. The rats squealed and chased them. His grandfather had taken his hand, but he let go now as they ran, and James sped ahead of him out of the dark alley. He did not want to stop running, but Arthur grabbed him after they had cleared the block.
This way!
He said and aimed his thumb down into a subway station. James followed him.
What was that thing?
An old enemy of your father's. A magical goblin named Wizazorcus.
Arthur glided mutely through the subway, his wet robe brushing the knees of a bedraggled man sleeping on an orange seat. James dogged his heels, damp, and feeling as though he'd stepped out of a horror flick. He was only vaguely aware of the peeling advertisements on the curved wall, or the bright overhead fluorescent tubes. His instinct to stay close to a man he barely knew seemed absurd, yet he did not question it. And when Arthur leaped off the platform onto the subway tracks, James unwittingly followed. At last, finding his tongue, James said,
I want to
A
know.
little way ahead there is a pocket of magic. It's been there for years. I don't want to use the lamp anywhere else. Wizazorcus can sense the use of magic, and he can be here in a heartbeat. That's how he found us back there. It's how he located us here in Erd too. But in this place, we can use magic and he won't know.
James said nothing.
Yes, there's something I forgot to tell you about your father.
His grandfather said, looking at him somewhat apologetically. There was a rumbling in the dark, and James realized the subway was approaching, clacking on the tracks. Arthur pulled out the old lamp, and the light of the subway speared them in the face.
He was evil.
And just like that, they vanished in a puff of smoke. Please like and subscribe for the latest episodes of the Midjourney Storyteller. One of the most puzzling things about Midjourney is that it has the hardest time understanding how many fingers we have on our hands. Not sure how it can master everything down to the smallest detail of the human anatomy, but it can't count the number of fingers on our hands. Anyway, enjoy this bloopers.
A flash blinded the boy, and then formidable laughter filled his ears. What did the boy see behind his eyes, I wonder? Do you remember, boy?
James did. That was the night Arthur had come up into the attic after hearing James scream. And when he saw the rats, he acted on instinct. He raised his hand and...
Wait. Grandpa?
Yes, James. Your grandpa had 6 fingers.
No, it can't be.
It is true, James.
He's a freak.
And you have 6 fingers too.
I do.
No!
Suddenly, James felt a hand on his shoulder.
Grandpa, why do I have 6 fingers?
It's true, James. It's an old family secret. We have 6 fingers, although it's unclear how you haven't known all this time. Our ancestors all had 6 fingers. It might be a result of generations of inbreeding. But those 6 fingers are fingers of power. Behold! Begone, devil!
Amazing!
That's right, James. We have the power to light 1,000 light bulbs, or turn an evil gremlin to a smear of grease on the pavement, all with our 6th finger.
I can't believe it.
And if you find that unbelievable, wait until you see what our 6 toes can do.